Thank you to Villanova and Professor Ravenel for having me. I'm delighted to be here among a group of thoughtful people trying to fix the policing issues that are troubling our country. Chicago is the city that first opened my eyes to the reality of rampant police misconduct. And I loved hearing Lori Lightfoot's keynote speech, hearing about the just addressing some of the issues Chicago is still having and will, I'm sure, continue to have. But has kind of been a theme throughout this today from many speakers and audience members, misconduct's a nationwide issue. The focus of my presentation today, as Shay noted, is on engaging communities, civilians particularly, in the police accountability process. And specifically what I'll be talking about is reforming the way that cities respond to complaints about police misconduct. So envision a situation which for some of you will be very easy to envision, and some it may seem more foreign. But envision you leave this symposium, and let's say as you're walking to your car or to the SEPTA, you have an encounter with a police officer. We'll say any number of things. The officer stopped you without a perceptible reason, which has been a heavy topic of discussion today, or deployed a taser unnecessarily, or used a racial slur on you, or was simply disrespectful in some way. You felt disrespected. So I realize that we come from a wide variety of perspectives and backgrounds and professions in this room, but I think that most of us would agree on a few basic propositions. So one, you should be able to file a complaint to somebody if you feel this encounter was troubling in some way. Two, the complaint should be investigated by an impartial investigator to determine whether it is true or not. And three, if the complaint is found to have some basis, it should result in consequences for the offending officer. And I realize that's obviously a massive simplification of all the things that could happen, but I think these are three things we should be able to agree on in this room. Unfortunately, that is too rarely the reality. And to quote a couple panelists from earlier today, we have a dysfunctional accountability system, and there is simply no accountability. And I believe that statement was made in the context of internal affairs in the discussing the process in Newark, but that is true in many situations. The reality is that many complaint review processes are either inherently deferential to the officer or even biased in a way that officers are infrequently held accountable for their misconduct. And I'm specifically going to be referring to primarily to internal affairs review systems and the issues I've found with that. But I want to echo what a number of speakers have said, which is that problems like this where there's a lack of accountability, what they do is they dangerously erode the legitimacy of law enforcement in the eyes of many communities, and particularly communities of color. People of color are the most likely to be victimized by police misconduct. I'll go ahead and say that, and I'm happy to answer questions about that later. And also the least likely to have their complaints sustained when they file a complaint. Last Thursday, as Lori alluded to, marked the 2-year anniversary of Laquan McDonald's death at the hands of Chicago police officer Jason Van Dyke. And that is an event that has received great attention. What not as many people talk about, although some of you certainly may know, is that before this shooting, Officer Van Dyke had been named in 18 prior complaints by civilians for incidents ranging from excessive force to racial slurs, and not one of those 18 prior complaints had ever been sustained. In April of 2015, North Charleston police officer Michael Slager shot and killed Walter Scott, another unarmed African-American man who was fleeing with his back to Slager when the officer fired 8 shots at him from behind. That event has also received enormous national attention. What is not always known is that Slager had been named in a prior complaint for using his taser on an African-American man with no justification, slamming the man to the ground and dragging him forcibly. An internal affairs investigation into that claim cleared the officer within weeks without ever contacting the complainant to obtain his side of the story. In September of 2015, New York Police Department Officer James Frascatore tackled a black tennis star, James Blake, who the officer mistakenly believed was a suspect in an identity theft investigation. That incident attracted nationwide attention because James Blake was a nationally known figure. What not everyone knows, although some do, is that before this incident, at least 3 other black men had filed complaints against the same officer, alleging that he attacked them without provocation, punched one man in the face, knocked another man to the ground, and used racial slurs in at least one of the assaults. All 3 of these complaints had been reported to the New York Civilian Complaint Review Board. None of them, Officer Frascatore had never received any discipline. So when we talk about officers with repeat offenses, that is not unique to Philadelphia, and that is unfortunately just plain old not as unique as it should be. I'm using these examples because they are incidents that have garnered nationwide attention, but they're not isolated. And so I want to give you some statistics on how civilian complaints often fare, particularly when they are reviewed by internal affairs units. I'll start with Newark, New Jersey, and then move on because that's already been discussed today. But in a 3-year period between 2010 to 2012, those are the most recent statistics we have for the public at least, Newark's internal affairs unit sustained between 4 to 7% of civilian complaints. And over a 5-year span, Newark did not discipline a single officer for an excessive force complaint. In Baltimore, the police department recorded 2,818 uses of force by police officers over a 6-year period. The internal affairs unit investigated 10 out of the 2,818, and they identified 1 as excessive. And I'll note, Baltimore over that same time period the internal affairs unit received 60 allegations of illegal strip searches and sustained only 1, closing many without contacting the complainant. So when we talk about willful misconduct, I would suggest that an illegal strip search is probably closer to that category than something like a shooting where it may be a heat of the moment thing. Camden, New Jersey, over a 6-year period received 485 complaints regarding excessive force. The internal affairs unit sustained 2. Ferguson, Missouri, in a I believe 2-year period, had 151 incidents involving use of force on civilians. All but 1 were approved. The Ferguson chief, and this speaks to Professor Harmon's statement that chiefs are critical pieces of this puzzle. The chief admitted that he would never even considered overruling a supervisor's conclusion that the use of force was appropriate. In Albuquerque, New Mexico, a 5-year period from 2010 to 2014, police officers killed 28 people. A Department of Justice investigation found that the majority of those shootings were unjustified. 0 officers were charged with any crimes. I believe that's actually changed. In 2015, 1 officer was charged with a crime resulting from a shooting and killing a civilian. San Jose, California, the police department there has never sustained a single complaint regarding racial bias within the police force. And that's a statistic as of 2014. So perhaps they've become much more aware in the last 2 years. I don't know. And then I'll just close with this one from Cleveland. When the Department of Justice investigated the Cleveland, Ohio internal affairs units, several officers admitted that their goal in an internal affairs investigation was to absolve the accused officers wherever possible. I would suggest that we have a major problem with just the idea of deferring exclusively, in many cases, to internal affairs units to review alleged misconduct by police officers within their own department. The reason I say the focus of my presentation is actually on getting communities more involved is that my suggestions for reform are that we need to create more civilian-based independent review agencies. And there are a lot of them. Mr. Anderson, the director of the Philadelphia Police Advisory Commission, spoke earlier today. Philadelphia has one model. There are a lot of models. There's not time to get into how all of the different independent review agencies could be structured, but I just want to suggest a few. Well, the first is what I just said, using independent review agencies rather than relying on internal affairs units for structuring these investigations into civilian complaints. This is much more of a provocative suggestion than you might think. Staff the agencies with civilians. A lot of independent review agencies, for example, Chicago's failed Independent Police Review Authority, which is now being replaced entirely. That was one of the criticisms of that agency, was that it was primarily staffed by former law enforcement officers. And you can see a potential problem in that too. The major complaint is that how would civilians know how to judge police conduct? And I'm happy to answer questions about that, but I think it's feasible to train civilians, as Mr. Anderson was referring to earlier, and that it's actual members of the community. Newark actually has a fascinating new model for their civilian complaint review board, in which there are 5 civil rights or community organizations that are required to be able to vote in to select a member of their staff to serve a 2-year role on the complaint board. Agencies need to have their own investigators. A couple people have talked about early warning systems and data. What I would suggest is that actually is something that could potentially be in the hands of not only the police department, but also the review agency, so that they could at least determine whether the police department is utilizing that data and doing anything with the officers who are the signs of warning. And then this is also a controversial proposal, but Newark, New Jersey is arguably the only review agency in the entire country that is allowed to actually impose discipline on offending officers. Most of the models we have now are pretty toothless. They can recommend discipline, but that's all they can do. And the last suggestion I want to make is that I think it was Supreme Court Justice Brandeis who once said, sunlight is the most effective of disinfectants. I think I am misquoting that. But he said something to that effect. And a lot of what we've discussed today, like, why don't people know this information? It's so hard to even get access to who are the offending officers, or even if we don't know names, how many officers of this type are on the force where they have received repeated complaints. And so I want to suggest that this is certainly not a simple proposal, this last one, but review agencies in addition to police departments, there needs to be more data that is available to the public so that the public can actually know and be righteously indignant if their police departments are not living up to the standards that the public assumes they should be.
Thank you all for staying here. I know it's a long day and it is a Friday, so I very much appreciate the opportunity to come and speak and share some of my insights on these issues. A special thanks to the students of the Law Review who've put together an amazing program. I want to thank, we forget sometimes as law professors how busy it is when you're a student. I mean, we think because we fly around and do all this work and teach and scholarship, we're very busy, but we forget how busy they are, so it's really a great thing to see all the student involvement. Another thing, I got to pop my own bubble. So that long list of classes that I teach are really my interests, right? So I want to make sure that that's clear, right? I teach criminal procedure, I teach evidence. I say that because I know there's some real constitutional law scholars in the House, and I want to make sure that they get their due. You know, there's also prosecutors in the audience and defense attorneys, and so what I'm about to talk about may rub some people in a way that doesn't make sense. To some other people, it's going to make absolute sense. So I'm going to try to live within that tension in the middle. So what I want to do is to talk about another dimension of accountability. We've been talking about accountability all day, but I want to give sort of the subaltern perspective, right? The underground, the subterranean perspective of this. And my talk is called Firepower to the People, Gun Carry Rights and Self-Defense to Curb Police Misconduct. So the driving question of the work I'm doing and this presentation are, what are the social implications of more civilians carrying more guns? In the last 10, 12 years, we've had even more liberalization of gun laws. And where I come from in Texas, we have concealed carry, which is pretty common. We have open carry, and as of August this year, we have campus carry, right? So my students can all be packing guns in class, wherever basically in our law school, right? So my question is what is the impact of that on police, right? More people, we saw in Dallas when there was individuals carrying police for the march that went on, there was a lot of confusion about who was the enemy there when you had so many people carrying guns lawfully. So the ultimate question I have is this going to chill police conduct in any meaningful way, the fact that more people are actually carrying guns? So when we think about the legislation that has been passed in the last decade plus, it is in response to a lot of the mass shootings that have occurred. And when you look at the legislative history, when you look at the conversations that went into the legislation, you hear this refrain, well, what if someone there had a gun, right? If someone there had a gun at the Columbine massacre, maybe some of the carnage could have been mitigated, right? At Sandy Hook, if someone there had a gun, maybe some of the lives could have been saved, right? And so this idea that cops use guns to save lives, you can too, is one of the driving memes of the legislation that has been passed over the last decade, right? So there's a distinct connection between defending others, right, and using guns to do that. So that is the theory of the new legislation. So what does self-defense allow? What does the criminal law allow in these instances? So we're back to criminal law 1L, and we have self-defense, good old self-defense, right? So if you're an innocent individual and you have to respond, and the force that you're responding to is unlawful, and it's pointed at you, right? You have unlawful force being applied to you, and you're innocent. You have the right to respond in proportion, right? You lawfully have a right to respond. So that's the basic law of self-defense. But the defense of others is simply you standing in the place of someone else. So if someone else has the right to self-defend, then you can take that person's place and defend that person, right? It's the defense of others. And then there's also these stand your ground laws, which essentially do away with the rules that you have to retreat if you're going to use deadly force. Well, understand your ground laws, you don't have to retreat, especially the stronger laws. You can stand your ground and fight back or shoot, as the case may be. In Indiana, there's very strong self-defense legislation that names public servants as those people who can be defended against, right? You can shoot a public servant who's trying to come into your house, and if you have a reasonable belief. So it's a very strong, even in Texas, where I come from, there's a very strong self-defense law. In the strict black letter law, you can self-defend against police, right? As long as you're not resisting first and that you're responding to unlawful deadly force, right? So it's all based on reasonable belief. So again, this is something that we may not ever be able to control. I want to bring this point up about self-defense because for some people it's an instinct. The law of self-defense, right, is the eldest law. When you're confronted in a situation where you have to self-defend, a lot of times you're not calculating, you're not thinking about what's going to happen to me in court, what's going to happen tomorrow. You're trying to get out of that immediate existential crisis that you're in. And that is something that most people are going to try to stay alive. Some would say it's a biological instinct to try to stay alive. So then if we take those two pieces, and then try to apply it in some of these sensational events that we've been seeing on TV over the last few years, these captured recordings, and try to make the same point or ask the same question. What if someone would have had a gun? Right? What if someone would have had a gun in this instance? Right, so I think about the Eric Garner case, and so at a certain point, the fact that he resisted, let's just cabin that for a second. But even then, if they're affecting an unlawful, if they were using excessive force in their arrest, right, then there may have been scope for intervention by a third party. It's very simple, right? So when he's on the ground saying, I can't breathe, and they're applying an illegal chokehold to him, then this looks like a perfect candidate for self-defense. Someone in the crowd could have taken a bat, tried to knock out one of the officers, or shoot in the leg, or something to that effect. So that's what I'm trying to get us to imagine. What is the scope? What's the potential for people in the community to help others who are in need, and when the perpetrators are actually the police? So my question is how can the criminal law play a greater role in achieving protection against police misconduct? Right? So it's a very normative question that I have. So my argument is very simple. Gun carry laws aim to protect citizens from unlawful bodily harm or death. Police are sometimes the source of unlawful bodily harm or death. Therefore, the laws necessarily intend protection from the police. So as such, the gun laws and self-defense laws offer a potential check on police abuses. That also puts more power into the hands of the people. That's why I call it firepower to the people. Now let me make something very clear. What I'm talking about is very distinct from ambushes against the police like we saw in Dallas, right? We're not talking about that. I'm talking about responding to unlawful deadly force. And I'm not even talking about unlawful arrests, right? If you are arrested unlawfully, you'll get your day in court. You do what the officer says, but if your life's in jeopardy, right? The old saying goes, right? What's the saying? We're having problems with sayings today, but better to be judged by 12 than carried by 6, right? And so that is sort of the idea, is that unlawful arrests, you'll get your day in court, but when it turns deadly, what good is court for you, right, when you're underground? So in this, I recognize there's a multiplicity of problems in seeing this thesis manifest in any way. And so let me just lay out a few of them so we can sort of get out some of the issues that are without a doubt a part of what I'm talking about. So one is that in the event that someone self-defends or perhaps defends another, is the police may just start shooting, right? Ask questions later. They feel the same way, right? That's something we had talked about last night at dinner, is that police also have the same idea. Better to be judged by 12, although we've learned today a lot of times that doesn't happen, than to be carried by 6. Police feel the same way. Another problem is that when we talk about defense of others, it could very well be that a citizen thinks that that person's getting what he deserves, and there would be no intervention. And you can also think about the racial lines that could take, right? That person doesn't deserve help. He's getting what he deserves. Another problem is with the gun laws, specifically felony disenfranchisement. So in these places, especially where we see a lot of police abuse, many of the people there can't own a gun or they can't possess a gun through federal felony disenfranchisement. can't possess a firearm if you've been convicted of a felony. That's a federal statute. So if we go back to the Eric Garner picture, statistically speaking, or if you talk about Harris County in Houston, where I come from, statistically speaking, people in minority neighborhoods have a less possibility statistically that they can carry a firearm or even possess one in the home. So that is also a problem. Another problem is that you just get charged for murder for self-defending, right? That's always a risk that you may take. If someone dies, if an officer dies, you can just be charged for murder and spend a lot of time in jail and have to defend yourself in a court of law. I'm going to talk about a case in just a minute where this sort of thing happens. And the last thing I'll talk about is just being wrong. There's a whole bunch of risks for being wrong in these instances. Imagine if you're trying to help somebody against a plainclothes officer, but you didn't know that. Well, that's your mistake, right? Or if you're incorrect in the amount of force you respond with, that could be your mistake. And so imperfect self-defenses are there, but there could be a high penalty. Talking mitigation from one type of homicide to another, but you're still going to be going through court. And so I recognize there's a lot of problems. We are at a point in our society where this is in some ways very, very basic, in some ways it's very, very radical. But we are at a point in time where people in certain communities are desperate for a way to change some of the problems that they're finding in the neighborhood. And so I kind of offer this as a potential. Let me talk about a couple of these individuals. I don't really have time to talk about Mr. Stewart. I'm going to talk about Mr. McGee and Mr. Guy. Both of these are Texas cases and almost identical situations, right? So both of them were asleep. Police carried out a no-knock warrant. They were alleged, or they were suspected of having drugs and money, and Mr. McGee was, I believe, suspected of growing marijuana as well. So police come in the wee hours of the morning, still dark outside, break into their house, and they do the same thing. They grab the gun. He's asleep with his wife. He's asleep with his pregnant girlfriend. And they start shooting, and police officers die. And so we have a really remarkable difference in the way these individuals get treated. Right? So when it comes to the grand jury, they refuse to indict Mr. McGee. But in the almost exact same fact scenario with Mr. Guy, he's still in jail right now. This happened over a year ago. He's still in jail fighting his murder charge. Right? So in some ways, this image gives us a glimmer of hope, but at the same time, entrenches us in some of the problems that we've been talking about all day, particularly with race. So this instance, right, where we see self-defense law alive and being used by grand juries to not indict someone, same thing gets used to put someone in jail awaiting a murder trial. So this last problem really points to a greater issue that race poses for my idea, and that is, well, what if we do have a more robust self-defense law? What if we did have more reasonable juries who could see that there was viable self-defense claims here? The question is, how might this split along racial lines? In other words, could we see many more of the Hank McGees, in other words, white potential defendants, getting off at the grand jury phase, while minority defendants end up getting dragged through the whole criminal process, or having to spend a lot of time in jail at the same time? Right? So you can kind of see how there's these problems as well. Now, I just want to make clear, I'm not talking about, in these instances, police don't have to die. We're not talking about self-defense, shoot until they die. It's about saving someone else's life, not killing the police. So I want to make that really clear. There's many alternatives to having to shoot to kill. Right? There's legs, there's other weapons that could be used that are short of anything that would kill someone. Right? So I want to make sure that we understand it doesn't mean police have to die. So that's one of the things that I want to make clear. And also, the more you look at these kinds of cases, one point starts to become very evident, and it is that these no-knock warrants are just deadly. They're deadly tools of law enforcement. And I would suggest, one of the things that I want to try to work on later is to figure out just what is their worth, right, in terms of what they produce. And as far as I can see right now, they seem like they should be abolished. These no-knock warrants put civilians in jeopardy. You wake up in the middle of the night, someone's trying to execute a no-knock warrant, you probably are going to shoot too. But the problem is that's lawful force. You're going to be in trouble. That's lawful force. So these no-knock warrants, very disheartening that the justification for these warrants often is to preserve cash, to preserve evidence, to preserve drugs. And we have, as a society, we are at this point where we are okay with that. We're okay with telling someone's spouse, a husband or a wife, a partner, that, well, your spouse, partner's not coming home tonight. Why? Well, we wanted to preserve evidence. That we would make that type of calculation. I'm not talking about someone's in the house being tortured, someone's been kidnapped, and there's an actual person who's in jeopardy. We're talking about preserving evidence, and we're willing to throw cops in the line of fire. We throw police in these unsuspecting situations, and then we have civilians in the same unsuspecting situation, and cops die as a result, and civilians die as a result. So unless I can be more enlightened on this point, the no-knock warrant seems like should be a relic of the past, right? Too many police are dying, and if we really, really care about the work that our police do, we wouldn't send them into these situations. Right. So my idea is that we need to have more robust law of self-defense, and we also need to have education. We need to educate gun carriers, right, about the law of self-defense. We need to educate police about the law of self-defense. The fact that those people out there who have guns, they have a lawful right in many instances to use them in self-defense if necessary. And we also need to educate just the people. Right? The jury that didn't indict Mr. McGee, they did it for a reason, because they understood. They got the facts and they understood this was a self-defense case. And so we need to see more of that from our juries. And I think we need more street law type campaigns, ways to get the word out so that we can end up with a more robust law of self-defense. All right. Thank you for your time and attention.
I do want to open this up to questions from the audience, but one of the things that came to mind, Professor Moran, when you were talking is we need some kind of an internal affairs system where civilian complaints are heard. But would it be the same type of system, say on the back end, say like, when Armando was speaking earlier about even when you've had cases that have been recommended for them not to be police anymore, that have ultimately gone to trial and the jury has found police not guilty, would it be on the back end with an arbitration system as well?
So I will make the suggestion, which is not to say that I'm completely convinced of this, but I want to go ahead and suggest that we may not need an internal affairs system at all. Okay. The model I would propose is that, and some cities have actually adopted this, that when a citizen intends to complain about a police officer, he or she is able to do that by going straight to the review agency, the civilian review agency, and not going to the police department. So fairly easy setup. It's just a matter, in that sense, there's more complications, but in that sense, it's just a matter of who you actually go to file a complaint, whether you do it online, in person, by phone, whatever. My proposal would be that the intake process should be handled entirely by a civilian review agency and not by internal affairs. I do think, and this maybe speaks to your question a little more directly, I do think obviously the police department also needs to know about what is going on, what complaints are being filed. But I think, yes, I would think that's more of a back-end system for the police department, they should be notified, but as far as their participation in the review process, I think that happens after the civilian review agency gets a chance to make a decision. Basically, I would suggest the reverse of how most models work, which is internal affairs accepts the complaint, handles the complaint, and then perhaps a review agency comes in to audit it or to investigate in some way, but they are the back end. I would reverse that.
It's interesting. So we have questions, yeah.
So, Rachel knows a little bit about this from being in Chicago, but we've had civilian oversight of the police department accepting citizens' complaints in Chicago since 1974. We have freestanding civilian investigators who investigate these cases in real time. There's lots of reasons why that model has failed. And I think one of the challenges with essentially outsourcing the oversight of the police department is that supervisors, individual officers, and to some extent police management, don't own responsibility for their own employees' behavior. I mean, if you think about what other organization that's so important to a city's livelihood outsources the discipline and oversight of their employees to a third party. I think you'd be hard pressed to find that model really anywhere. And yet, that's what we have done and we are progressively moving towards, which I think causes some problem. And interestingly, Sam Walker, who's kind of the dean of this, been investigating this probably and writing about it for 40 years, has been moving more towards bringing the model back inside of police departments, but holding them accountable in ways that we've not seen before. But the statistics that Rachel led off with are pretty, give you a great pause at a minimum about whether or not we are yet in a time which we can bring policing back to the department. But I do think it, having frankly run that organization in Chicago for a time, I do think it causes a disconnect because officers just don't take the process seriously when it's a civilian, number one, strike one, outside of the police department, strike two, trying to tell them how to do their job when they've never been the police. It's an issue.
So if I can just respond to that, two things. One is, I'm really glad you brought up this point because one thing I failed to clarify is there are some models that combine the two, which is that they are civilian-based review agencies, but that officers from the police department, or representatives from the police department are allotted a certain amount of slots. So let's say the review agency is comprised of 10 full-time paid employees. 2 of those would be representatives of the police department. The thinking there is that they have equal access to the information and they can represent the voice of the police department and how it's reviewed, but they don't get to do it before civilians ever get to look at it. That's one proposal. Seattle, for example, has a police commission, which is, it's not exactly the same as a review agency I'm proposing, but that model has actually worked pretty well for Seattle, which is that it's run by civilians, but they have police department representatives. The other thing, though, is, to speak to your question or your concern that police officers may not take this seriously, I agree with that. I do think that's a concern. I also don't think police officers necessarily have to take internal affairs seriously in a lot of departments because it is so, the internal affairs units are often so unlikely to sustain. So I completely, in many ways, agree with your concerns, but I'm not sure that we're in a place where we can just continue saying, let's let the police handle this.
No, and part of the reason that they don't take internal affairs seriously is because they're exonerated more often than not. But also because, again, there's no transparency into what's actually going on inside of police departments and holding them accountable. They don't have to pay for settlements and judgments. It doesn't hit their bottom line. And frankly, because discipline in many instances takes so long, there's such a disconnect between when the incident happens and then when there's a final judgment, if you will. It's in Chicago. It's not unusual for the police board for us to get cases that are 4, 5, 6 years old. So the system clearly is broken. But I think we've got to think about all civilian all the time. Does that work? Does it put, frankly, supervisors in this over responsibility for what's actually happening with their officers.
Can I just also?
Sure, of
I
course.
know,
Absolutely.
I just wonder if the comparison that you're making is actually an opposite, or if it is, as you say, right, because you were comparing to outsourcing work that other agencies might do. But it seems like the stakes are so much different when we're talking about police officers, that maybe that's why there would be that sort of measure to get civilians involved and make sure that they are. Earlier in your talk, you had mentioned the code of silence among police officers, and that's a huge impetus to want to bring in civilians for some of the oversights.
But don't get me wrong, I'm not saying that involving civilians in the process doesn't make sense, I think it does. But what I'm just saying is, there is the real problem when you literally outsource every single citizen's complaint, as we do in Chicago, to a separate civilian-led, civilian investigative unit. In some ways, it has the perverse effect, I think, of absolving supervisors and the head of the police department from responsibility over managing the problem. Because complaints are anonymous, meaning the supervisors often don't even know that their officers have complaints. So that's a solvable problem. But they're not involved in the process of changing behavior because it's viewed as something that's illegitimate because it's outside of the department and done by someone else.
Two-part question. Are there any cities right now, large cities, where they have a civilian review board that has the power to sanction? And if so, does the commissioner have the power to veto that? And then secondly, if there are such models, who's funding these? I mean, are these paid positions on these boards? Where's the money coming from?
Sure. So Newark, New Jersey Civilian Complaint Review Board, which was just created in 2015 and is still not completely up and running, was the first in the country to give the review board, the civilian review board, authority to impose discipline. So every other model in the country says you can recommend discipline. Washington D.C. might say it because it falls into the Newark category. I disagree, but most people would agree that Newark is the only one. It's funded by the city of Newark. There's a lot of controversy surrounding the Civilian Review Board, and we really don't have statistics at all yet about whether it works. But it does give, the way it works is, if I can recall the charter language correctly, it gives the review board authority to impose discipline. So the review board would review the complaint, decide the police officers committed some sort of misconduct. Perhaps it will just use a 10-day suspension as an example. It can actually require that of the police department. But the exception is if the police chief reviews the discipline and objects to it, the police chief can call a hearing before the city council. And I think it's language similar to preponderance of the evidence. So the police chief would have to essentially would have the burden of proving that the required discipline was incorrect, was wrong, and then that could be overturned. The review board's imposition of discipline could be overturned.
Okay, so we all understand that police have a very hard job, and as a result, they're tasked first of all with upholding the law, and in order to do that, they're given the right to use deadly force when necessary in order to do that. But to the other professor's question or scenario, as the citizenry gets more educated on these self-defense laws and stand your ground laws, do you see it as inevitable where, for example, now you see it all the time where citizens that feel like it's a situation where excess force is being used, now they pull out their cell phones. But do you see it inevitable where someone will decide, okay, well, there's being excessive force used there, so let me intervene, not only with my cell phone, but with a gun or a baton or what have you. And then once that happens, what position does that put the police officer in? Does it put them in a position to then retaliate with deadly force?
No, that's definitely one of the problems with a model like that. The thing I was trying to get at earlier, though, when I put up self-defense as nature's eldest law, is that there's going to be a class of people who will do that anyway. I mean, so either they have the phone or they have the gun, they're going to intervene anyway because that's a part of that person's nature that's gonna do that. So, yeah, I mean, I realize, you can imagine all kinds of scenarios, right? There's an officer down, you've got the weapon in your hand, and the police car comes up, and, what do you do, right? So that's there. That's why the whole point about education, we need to recognize this is an ancient principle that we've inherited from the common law that's still alive today, and we need to strengthen it because there are these instances, right? We've said it earlier, the overwhelming number of police, I have so many friends that are out there, they're really trying to change the world. But that doesn't mean that there aren't serious problems that need to be dealt with in a serious way. If we want higher accountability of police officers, we need more robust self-defense laws. If we want to treat the police like they're exceptional, which is the exact opposite of my thinking, I feel like police should be held to a higher standard than civilians, because this is their job. And so if that's the way you feel, then, if you feel that police need to be held to a higher standard, then you would advocate a more robust self-defense law. So that's the way I'm looking at it.
Yes.
If you want to get back to legitimacy, in England or Japan, where people don't walk around with guns, you don't have guns in the civilian population, and the police are basically unarmed, you don't find the extent of excessive force issues that you do in the United States. So it seems like guns are the added to the mix that creates most of these issues. And even Scalia said you have no constitutional right as a private party to have a gun outside your house. Now, a state like Texas, where somehow or other they've lost their collective minds, wants everybody walking around with guns, and you're going to have this vigilante justice along the border. They have militia groups now that have taken it upon themselves to go out armed and possibly shoot people that they think are crossing the border, even if they're like 50 or 100 miles from the border, because apparently you don't have the same constitutional protections if you're crossing the border. So you have situations, and to escalate it even further and encourage some sort of vigilante action or people to deputize themselves as the arm of the law and stand in for their party seems like things are going to go way beyond where they should. And it's not really the common law. The common law was if you resisted the king's justice, you were committing treason, which was a capital offense. So you don't really have the right to resist the police.
Right. Well, not for but
Except in Texas.
yeah, no. In Texas, the next move is mandatory. We could have some.
Yeah, go ahead.
Hi, and this might go to either speaker. In both scenarios that you proposed, you suggested that civilians should be making a determination either after the fact or before the fact that the force that the police are using is excessive or unjustified. Those, in a lot of cases, are really legal conclusions, not necessarily just factual conclusions. So how do you take account?
So I think that's when I prefaced the talk, that the idea that I was trying to get at is that we allow civilians to make that assessment all the time with when we talk about the legislation, the legislative histories, the idea is that if a civilian was there and had a gun, that civilian could make the very same assessment that you're talking about. So I guess I don't understand why we would vest civilians with the authority or the know-how to do it in one situation but not another. That's why the legislation was created. Was a lot of the impetus was because we want people to be able to defend others. And the logic is, obviously, that they would know when there's self-defense that's necessary. Even as a person, we have to know, right? We have to know that there's a right to respond at a certain point. So just because the other party happens to be a police officer, we're taxed with knowing when to fight back.
The question?
Yeah, sure. This question for SpearIt. So there are two ways to read or understand your argument. So the first would be kind of a lock-in, originalist retrieval of the original meaning of the Second Amendment in the vein of what Justice Scalia did in Heller and then in and that is that the Second Amendment is a doomsday provision. An armed populace is able to resist the government. All the rights in the Bill of Rights run against the government. So what you lay bare is this is really a right against the government, the police. We're not comfortable with that in our sort of 21st century, and so it's jarring for us to hear that. But that's exactly what the right is about. You know, you could read Chief Judge Kaczynski in the Ninth Circuit who says that. I just taught this the other day. But the other possibility would be, I think what this gentleman from the FOP was suggesting, is this is a reductio ad absurdum argument, where you say, you sort of take those propositions and like show they lead to places that we find to be very upsetting and jarring, and that maybe that means that we ought to reject some of these other arguments, such as the sort of the castle doctrine and some of these other things. And I guess what I wanted to, because it also lays bare kind of like the NRA's rhetoric when it talks about gun rights, is that I think the NRA is careful to not talk about gun rights as against the police officers or the government. It's always talking about your neighbor or the people from down the street from that other neighborhood who might come around your home. And so your argument is an interesting one because it causes us to reflect on maybe what the original meaning was. So I guess my question is about your sincerity here. So are you really pressing this argument, or is this the reductio ad absurdum to make us think and reconsider gun control?
Yeah, no, thank you. So that's obviously, and it goes back to sort of the no knock. I mean, we have a society where we virtually have unlimited gun possession and all types of weaponry, and then we expect police to go out and do their job in a way that makes sense. And it's going to be very difficult just because of all the weaponry that's out there. So I recognize that. I guess what pushes this project for me is that I had a student one time when I presented this concept. I said, I didn't know that we could defend against the police. And it was that idea that I wanted to sort of push back against. And so that's where the project came. Because the point is that yes, you can under certain conditions. And so we shouldn't forget that. So that's pulling from that's how it is.
Yeah, go ahead.
But yes, you can doesn't mean yes, you should.
Right.
It's exactly the same thing that we're talking about with police use of force. Just because you can use force doesn't mean you should use force, and that the sanctity of life has to come into play.
No, the point is that you have to use
Let me
force.
finish the point. We know exactly what that is. Talk to the fiance of Mr. Castile in Minnesota. He had a concealed carry. He was telling the officer that he had it, and he got shot. Now, we can speculate as to why that is. I'm gonna say because he was a black man with a gun. We know from even further back in our history, the Black Panthers, right? They were all about self-defense. What happened with them? Everywhere they were, the police investigated them, they interrogated them, and in many instances, they killed them. The notion that people of color, which I think is where you're going, can use the same kind of force in self-defense against police officers, and it's okay, frankly, is absurd. And I was gonna ask the same question that the professor asked. I wasn't sure if you were serious or not, but I would urge you in talking about it, you gave passing reference to it, the practical implications of your idea on black and brown communities taking it upon themselves to decide that they are going to use deadly force against the police, I think, frankly, would be absolutely catastrophic for people who look like me and you.
But that could be true, or it may not be true. I mean, let's.
I think we've got evidence that it would.
Well, even in the cases of Castile, I mean, if you think about the scenario, there was a perfect suggestion, at least a place where self-defense might have been employed successfully after he had been shot. When that gun was still pointed out at the woman, that seems like there would have been a ground for defending, because who knows if she was going to get shot. So that seems to be, so again, I preface this, it may seem absurd to you, but there's many who feel that there's a point of no return. We're at that point. when people can be killed in broad daylight, caught on camera, and nothing happens to anybody, you should expect this sort of absurd thinking to happen because police are acting absurd.
We have one more question right here.
I was gonna say, you said it far better than I would, but I think it would be dangerous for someone who's white to try to intervene in a situation like Eric Garner or any of them. I think it would be suicide for someone who's African American.
I realize that. But again, it happens. People are getting off. People are getting off for defending against police, and you guys are saying, I'm not saying that brown and black people shouldn't have the same right to do that. That seems absurd to me.
No, it's not to have the right, but to say to have, I'm sorry, but we know what the consequences are going to be. When we had earlier today, talking about African Americans getting arrested just for filming it on a video, or talking back, just asking why am I being arrested, to have a gun, I just don't see any situation where that would end well. Not that it should be that way. Maybe the only way we'll ever have gun control is if you do have African Americans exercising their rights. I mean, that was the only thing with the Black Panthers, that there was, the time when the NRA was starting to talk about gun control, but as a practical thing in the heat of the moment, I think anybody would be at risk trying to intervene right then. It doesn't make it right.
I think Mr. Guy in jail, I think he's glad that he did what he did, because he's alive.
Oh, and he shouldn't be in jail.
He's alive.
We have good
Oh, yeah,
time.
you have glad he's alive and he shouldn't be in jail. I mean, that's a terrible disparity there.
One more question. Go ahead.
Can I just say, I think that SpearIt's argument, very provocative argument, reflects frustration with a situation where the Supreme Court allows police to get off based upon their mistaken belief in the lawfulness of their conduct in ways that result in people being killed, innocent people being killed, or police acting without real authority, but yet they're excused. And so I see this argument as helping us frame a very important debate about the police use of force and our willingness as a society to excuse even mistaken and deadly use of force. And the lack of recourse, especially in those communities disproportionately impacted by the police's use of force, which, as he says, are the very communities that usually aren't as well armed as the dominant culture. And so, I mean, I can see that, I agree with the other speakers that, the practical, to carry this out in reality would be disastrous. But the debate that he's trying to get us to engage in, I think, is an important one.
I agree, it's really provocative. We are out of time.
You know what, actually, before you close out, I just want to say a few words to sort of wrap up the evening. Sorry, Shay, but, I think that I want to sort of take us full circle and end where we began. And for those of you who were here this morning, when Dean Alexander opened up the session, one of the things he mentioned to us was his sort of favorite phrase in the Constitution. And what he suggested to us was this idea of to form a more perfect union. And I think that today we've had a lot of discussions about can versus should. And what I would suggest is that we remember his invitation to us, because what we've engaged in is an important debate here today and an important discussion here today. And no matter what, that's progress. And when I started thinking about this idea of a more perfect union, I remembered that was actually the title of Obama's speech that we sort of call his speech on to address race. And the way he ended that speech is he said, this is where we start. It's where our union grows stronger, and so many generations have come to realize over the course of this 221 years since a band of patriots signed that document in Philadelphia, that is where the perfection begins. And so our perfection begins with this conversation and this debate. So thank you for being a part of it today, and I hope you all continue it on your own.